Praise the Lord. Hallelujah. The overview of the book of Proverbs and also the analysis of the book of Proverbs. May the Lord richly bless you. Proverbs as a book, we believe is a collection of moral and religious maxims. In other words, religious sayings or some slogans containing instructions concerning right living, also brief discourses, or maybe talking about a subject on wisdom, justice, temperance, industry, purity, and many more. In these pitchy sayings, a sharp contrast is drawn between wisdom and folly, or let's put it, wisdom and foolishness, okay? And then also a contrast between righteousness and sin. Authors, Solomon is generally credited with the authorship of a large portion of this book, Proverbs. It is quite probable that all were not original with him. In chapter 30 and chapter 31, we found out that the words of Agar and Lemuel, okay? The words of Agar and Lemuel were different from the actual words of Solomon, okay? Date written, Solomon's Proverbs were probably written and also collected and edited between his character decline, okay, which 1 Kings 11 will talk about it, 931 BC, and then also the time of King Hezekiah, which is 715 to 686 before Christ, BC, or before Common Era. They have a way they call it, okay, BCE or whatever. And others later collected them. Okay, the purpose of this book of Proverbs is to give moral instructions, okay, for moral instruction. To whom written, especially the book as is written, specifically, it's written to young people because it starts by saying, my son. Is used frequently and demonstrates Solomon's personal concern for his children. That's what other theologians believe. It also applies to the people of any wise sage, okay, who will wish to give guidance to his young learners or a young learner. The main theme is the fear of the Lord, which occurs 14 times. So the main theme of the book of Proverbs is the fear of the Lord, which occurs 14 times. The fear of the Lord, okay? There are a number of subjects discussed in the book of Proverbs, okay, which are numbered here. I think I've been able to number up to 20. So we're going to go through it. Number one subject that is discussed is about anger. Anger is part of every human life. Even God, who is holy, sometimes can be angry. But it depends on the way where you take it that it becomes sin. Okay? So anger. Proverbs 14 verse 17. We'll talk about it, okay? These are some of the, some of the scriptures that backs the subject, okay? Anger, Proverbs 14:17, and then verse 29, 15 verse 18, 16 verse 32, 19 verse 11. Number two, benevolence, doing good, okay? Proverbs chapter 3 verse 9 to 10, 11 verse 24 to 26, 14, 21, chapter 19 verse 17, and then 22 verse 9. Number three, children, correction of children, okay? Proverbs chapter 13, verse 24. 19 verse 18, 22 verse 6, 15 verse 23, and then verse 13 to 14. Number 4, entices. Okay, when you get entices. Chapter 4 verse 14, Proverbs chapter 9 verse 13, chapter 16 verse 29. Number 5, another subject is fear of God. Is seen in Proverbs chapter 1 verse 7, chapter 3 verse 9, chapter 9 verse 10, chapter 10 verse 27. Chapter 14, verse 26, chapter 27, verse 15, and then verse 16. Okay, chapter 15, verse 16, and then verse 33. Chapter 16, verse 6, chapter 19, verse 23, chapter 23, verse 17, chapter 24, verse 21. Okay, and then it talks about fools. And then the fools, it categorizes being slanderous. It becomes like it's foolishness to do that, okay? Chapter 10, verse 18. And then people who don't care about their lives, like somebody will join any group, somebody will get into any kind of habit. Or let's say, do you want to learn how to smoke? You just join them. Do you not learn how to do this? It's like they short-live their lives. They don't care, okay? That's Proverbs chapter 10, verse 21. And then mischief makers, people who are wicked, okay? People who plot to do evil. Chapter 10, verse 23. And then self-righteous. When you think you don't need God, you are okay. Chapter 12, verse 15. And then irritable. There are some people, they can, they fall within that category, okay? Chapter 12, verse 16. And then there are people who mock at sin. They are sinning and they are laughing. They don't care. Chapter 14, verse 9. Okay? Even if you talk about God can do this, they say they don't care. There are no remorse. Okay? Mock at sin, 14, verse 9. And then there are some people, they talk nonsense. Chapter 15, verse 2. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 2. And then insensible. Okay? You understand the word. Chapter 17, verse 10. Dangerous. There are some people, they're very dangerous. They love doing that, okay? Dangerous activities, they plan. Chapter 17, verse 12. Visionary. Chapter 17, verse 24. And then meddlesome. People always want to get into people's stuff. They want to cause trouble, okay? They meddlesome. Chapter 20, verse 3. And then people who despise wisdom. They don't like, they don't love to be taught things about wisdom in life. Chapter 23, verse 9. And then stupidity, okay? Or being stupid. Chapter 27, verse 22. Self-confident. Chapter 14, verse 16. Chapter 28, verse 26. And then garrulous, okay? Chapter 29. Verse 11. Then we come to about friendship, chapter number 7. Scriptures in Proverbs that really talk about friendship. Okay? Chapter 17, verse 17. 18, 24. Chapter 19, verse 4. Chapter 27, verse 10 to 17. And then indolence. Okay? Indolence also has scriptures, which is chapter 6, verse 6 to 11. Chapter 10, verse 4 to 5. Chapter 12, verse 27. Chapter 13, verse 4. 15, verse 19. 18, verse 9. Chapter 19, verse 15. 24, verse 20. Chapter 19, verse 15 and verse 24. Chapter 20, verse 4. Chapter 20, verse 4 and verse 13. And then chapter 22, verse 13. Chapter 24, verse 30 to 34. Chapter 26, verse 13 to 16, indolence. And then knowledge, divine knowledge. If you want to see scriptures in Proverbs that talk about God's knowledge, God's kind of knowledge, okay? Chapter 15, verse 11. Chapter 21, verse 2. Chapter 24, verse 12. And then we go to the next one is oppression. Okay, people will oppress others. Chapter 14, verse 31. Chapter 22, verse 22. Chapter 28, verse 16. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 16. And then number 11 is pride. Okay? Every one of us has a little bit of pride in us. Okay? It's part of human nature, but you don't have to. You don't have to exert on it so much. You don't want everybody to know that you are prideful, because it will bring you, God hates that. God will bring you down when you become so prideful, okay? So pride, there are other aspects of pride that you can do, like Paul will say that I pride myself being safe from darkness, that I'm in Christ and all that. So there are aspects of that. We could use another word, okay? But pride itself is not good. Chapter 6, verse 17. Chapter 11, verse 2. 13, verse 10. 15, verse 25. 16, verse 18 to 19. 18, verse 12, and verse 21. Okay, verse 12. Chapter 21, verse 4. They all talk about pride. Chapter 24, verse 29. No, chapter 21, verse 4 and verse 24. Chapter 29, verse 23, chapter 30, verse 13. And then number 12 is prudence. Okay, prudence. Chapter 12, verse 23, 13, verse 16, 14, verse 8, and verse 15. Chapter 18, chapter 14, verse 8, verse 15, verse 18. Chapter 15, verse 5, chapter 16, verse 21. Chapter 18, verse 15, and chapter 27, verse 12. The 13th word is scorners, okay, to be scornful, scorners. Chapter 3, verse 34, chapter 9, verse 7, chapter 14, verse 6, chapter 19, verse 25, chapter 24, verse 9. And then the next one, the next one is strife, okay? People who always trying to cause commotion. They're always trying to cause, division and fighting and all that, okay? Chapter 3, verse 30, 10, verse 12, 15, verse 18, 16, verse 28, 17, verse 1, and verse 14, and verse 19, chapter 18, verse 6, and verse 19, chapter 20, verse 3, chapter 22, verse 10, and chapter 22, verse 10, chapter 25, verse 8, chapter 30, verse 33. And then we come to temperance, okay? Temperance. Chapter 20, verse 1 and verse 21. Chapter 17, verse 23. Okay, hold on. It looks like I'm making a mistake. Temperance, chapter 20, verse 1. Chapter 21, verse 17. Chapter 23, verse 1 to 3. Chapter 23, verse 29 to 35. And chapter 25, verse 16. Chapter 31, verse 4 to 7. 16, the tongue. Okay? 16th subject that we're talking about, the tongue. We are talking about 20 things that Proverbs, teach us about back in scriptures. Okay? The tongue. Chapter 4, verse 24. 10, verse 11 to 32. That's where I think it talks a lot about tongue. Chapter 12, verse 6, and verse 18. Chapter 22, chapter 12, verse 6, and verse 18, and verse 22. Chapter 13, verse 3. Okay? Proverbs chapter 14, verse 3. And then chapter 15, verse 1 to 7, and verse 23. Chapter 16, verse 13, verse 23, verse 27. Chapter 17, verse 4, chapter 18, verse 7, and verse 21. Chapter 19, verse 1, chapter 20, verse 19. Chapter 21, verse 23. Chapter 26, verse 28. And then chapter 30, verse 32. They all talk about the tongue. Unjust gain. Chapter 10. Okay, Proverbs chapter 10, verse 2. Chapter 13, verse 11. Chapter 21, verse 6. Chapter 20, verse 8. And then wealth. If you want to know scriptures that talk about wealth, that you can learn wisdom about. Chapter 10, verse 2. And verse 15. Chapter 11, verse 4. Chapter 28. No, verse 4 and verse 28. Chapter 15. Chapter 11, verse 4 and verse 28. Chapter 13, verse 7 and verse 11. Chapter 15, verse 6. Chapter 16, verse 8. chapter 18, verse 11, chapter 19, verse 4, chapter 27, verse 24, 28, verse 6, and verse 22. And I will talk about women, evil women, chapter 2, verse 16 to 19. Chapter 2, verse 16 to 19, chapter 5, verse 3 to 14, and then verse 20, okay? And verse 23, chapter 5, verse 3 to 14, verse 20, verse 23, chapter 6, verse 24 to 35, chapter 7, verse 5 to 27, chapter 9, verse 13 to 18. And then the last one, all the 20, all the 20 stuff that it talks about, okay? The 20 subjects, it ends with, we had evil women, and now it ends with good women. Chapter 5, verse 18 to 19. And then chapter 31, verse 10 to 31, which is, we all know. Okay, the key words is wisdom, okay? The key words is wisdom. Understanding wisdom. The key verse is chapter 1, verse 4. The notable passages are wisdom, the call of God calling you and I to receive wisdom or to learn or to understand wisdom. Chapter 1, verse 20 to 23. Okay, chapter 1 all the way to chapter 23. Okay. The source of wisdom is chapter 2, verse 6. The preciousness of wisdom is chapter 3, verse 13 to 26. Wisdom, the principal thing that we all need to pursue, chapter 4, verse 5 to 13. The richest treasure is Proverbs chapter 8, verse 11 to 36. And then the feast of wisdom, chapter 9, verse 1 to 6. We come to the synopsis. Fatherly counsel, the way it's been written, right? It's like a father trying to counsel his children, his son, and then also and then it goes to all the children too. Fatherly counsel and warnings with exhortations concerning the attainment of wisdom. Okay, so we're going to see from chapter 1, Proverbs chapter 1 all the way to chapter 7. It talks about like a father trying to counsel his children. Proverbs chapter 1 to chapter 7. Chapter 1, chapter 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's about counseling, like a father trying to counsel his children about how to attain wisdom, okay? And then the second part of the synopsis is wisdom's call. Okay, so chapter 8 and chapter 9 talks about the wisdom always is like personification. It makes it like a woman trying to call for something. So he will use she, right? So wisdom calling for you and I that we should come and get the wisdom. We should come and get it because it's going to save us in the life that we live in, okay? And then the third part of the synopsis is the Proverbs of Solomon, okay? Even though we believe all these were written all of them are written by Solomon. So the contrast, now we see that the contrast between good and evil, wisdom and foolishness, that takes us from chapter 10, chapter 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, chapter 18, chapter 19, and chapter 20. So the whole book of Proverbs chapter 10 to chapter 20 gives you the difference between pursuing goodness or being good and also somebody being evil. So you see the end of them, okay? Chapter 10 all the way to chapter 20. And then it also talk about we choosing wisdom than foolishness, okay? When we say somebody is wise, it doesn't mean because they are grown up. No. There are so many grown-ups who do foolish things. You will never believe. Even children will not do that, okay? So it doesn't mean the more you grow means you are wise. No. You might have wisdom about certain areas, but it's not everybody who is wise, okay? So wisdom and foolishness or folly, chapter 10 all the way to 20. So he's going to talk about good and evil, and then wisdom and foolishness, okay? And then the fourth part of the synopsis is proverbial maxims. Okay, I think I've already explained. We're going to come back down here. Okay, so the proverbial maxims. So very important proverbs. Okay, that are taught. Okay, and then the counsels that are given. Also, chapter 21 to chapter 24. Proverbs chapter 21 to 24 talks about proverbial maxims and counsels. Okay, and then Proverbs of Solomon were also copied by some men of King Hezekiah. So that theologians believe that those kind of, written proverbs, okay, which were carried by the men who were with King Hezekiah, okay, they believe that that's what is written in Proverbs chapter 25 all the way to chapter 29, okay, and then we all know the words of Agar, that we believe that it's like an oracle, okay? Somebody like talking the wisdom of God, the mind of God, which is Proverbs chapter 30. If you have read it before, you're going to see it gives contrast about things that are very difficult to understand. So he's going to talk about the way, like a serpent walks in a rocky grounds. He's going to talk about, a man and a young woman who just married, how they're able to carry through that until certain stage, okay, certain age, he's going to talk about it because he's saying it's not easy. It's just sometimes it baffles human mind, okay. And then he's going to talk about also something about sheep, I've read it before, so I've taken time to read it. So he gives the difference between certain things in life that cannot be understood, okay. God knows how he made it that way, okay. So that is the part of Proverbs chapter 30. And then Proverbs 31, as we all know, the words of King Lemuel. They believe that a mother's advice, okay, about how a man or a king should be careful about, about drunkenness and women, okay. They are the two things that, they believe that the mother advised her son, okay, about King Lemuel, which is Proverbs chapter 31 that we all talk about. And then the description of an ideal wife, which is Proverbs chapter 31, verse 10 to 31. And then the spiritual lesson we learn here is that Solomon was a guidepost, okay, rather than an example. He pointed the way to wisdom, but in the latter part of his life, he did not walk in it. You see, sometimes, beloved, some of us I would say that some of us, even though it wasn't our era, some of us have been able to even live alone without a woman, okay? Living as like right now as a single. So I don't understand that a man, you have your own wives about 10, or you started with one woman, okay? So let's say you have 10 women. Solomon, you don't need 1,000, okay? Even 2, 3, or 4, even let's say you're West. But Solomon God gave him all this wisdom and he messed it up, going after women. It's not too. Our day, even for somebody to marry 2, we will say, hey, you have sinned. You have messed up marriage. He took 1,000 women, slept with 1,000 women. Okay? But maybe we go to heaven, we're going to see him there. So that's why I say going to heaven is not much about marriage. It's much more about God, accepting Christ, and then having a covenant relationship, serving God. Okay, that's what is much. Because we are in the grace. Grace does not mean we should go and sleep around or do like Solomon did. But some of them, what they did, we have not even seen that kind of sense before. So that makes you that you don't allow anybody to belittle you as a child of God. Okay, so we see that in the life of Solomon. You're giving us all this wisdom, but he failed. Okay? He failed. I mean, sometimes I ask myself, as a man of God, what I have gone through. If they go through, let's see what they will do. Okay? Would they be able to still continue to do what God says they should do? Okay, so Solomon, that's what he did. He's showing us all this wisdom, but he became like what? A guidepost rather than being an example. So he pointed the way of wisdom which he knew. He was able to use it to make money. But the rest, Okay, but in the latter part of his life, he did not walk in it. Hence, his son Rehoboam also followed and also messed up like that, and then followed his father's example rather than his counsels, and became a foolish and evil ruler. Okay, that's the point. Okay, so the prominent people is Solomon, Hezekiah's men, Edgar, and Lemuel. Okay, so I'm just going to, I know I've taken a little bit time here, so I'm just going to do like more of like AI style. Okay, so chapter 1 to 9, it talks about wisdom's call and foundation. These chapters form an introduction emphasizing the value of wisdom and warning against foolishness. Okay, chapter 1 to 9. So Proverbs 1, it will talk about purpose of Proverbs is to teach wisdom, discipline, and understanding. It begins with a warning against joining sinners. Don't join them. Wisdom is personified as a woman, I've already talked about, calling out in the streets, warning of the consequences of ignoring wisdom. Okay? Chapter 2, the pursuit of wisdom brings protection, understanding, and guidance. Wisdom will guard us from evil paths and immoral people. Chapter 3, trust in the Lord with all your heart. And wisdom brings life, health, and prosperity. So if we gain wisdom, it helps us, it saves us, it makes us also wealthy. Okay, if we pursue wisdom. Okay, and then also part of Proverbs chapter 3, discipline from God is a sign of his love. Okay, and then Proverbs chapter 4, a father's instruction to seek wisdom, as I already said, is from chapter 1 all the way to chapter 7. Okay, that is talking about like a father's counsel. Okay, 1 to 10, let's take it. Okay, a father's instruction to seek wisdom. And then wisdom is supreme. Okay, wisdom is the highest. Okay, so he says, get wisdom at all cost. We all need wisdom. Okay, how to be able to, how to be able to come up with solution when there's a problem. Like you are in a stage you don't know what to do. Wisdom will help you to be able to, wisdom, the God's kind of wisdom will help you to be able to manage things and bring solution out of that. Okay. And then chapter 4 also talks about avoid the path of the wicked. Okay. Don't take them as your friends. Okay. And there are many people who go to church who do what Proverbs is saying. They are in the church, but they don't care bringing somebody's life down. They don't care. Wickedness, evil doing, competition. There are some people, they are filled with, they can't stand that their brothers are doing it, their brothers are making it, and they are not making it. Okay, it's a lot among Christians. Okay, so if you know that, you move away from such people. Avoid the path of the wicked. Chapter 5, warning against adultery and seductive women. Okay, seductive woman. And the faithfulness in marriage is encouraged. Okay, yeah, because I always say that if your husband is not messing up, treating you well, why should you disturb him? If your wife is not sleeping behind you, today is common. Okay, if your wife is not sleeping behind you, if he's not coming up with dubious means, she's not respectful and she's not humble, then why do you want to go behind her and take another wife? So why do you want to go and cheat behind her if she's a woman of virtue, like a virtuous woman? Okay, so you have to be faithful in your marriage, if the other. But rather, unfortunately, a lot of women that are being raised in churches, so already all of them already they've messed up their lives already. Then if they see things are not working for them, they rush to church and get into the choir. Okay, so if you're not careful, you're trying to go find such a woman, your life will be messed up. Okay, that's why it ends the book with a virtuous woman. You need the right woman. Okay, so faithfulness in marriage is encouraged. Chapter 5. Chapter 6, warnings about financial entanglements, laziness, dishonesty. And then list 6 things that the Lord hates. 6 things that the Lord hates. Okay, so we always talk about that we will choose fornication as the highest sin, but the 6 things that God hates, fornication is not part of it. And those 6 things is part of many Christians and pastors. Those things, 6 things God hates, that's what they do. Okay, so watch yourself first before you point your finger at somebody. Chapter 6, another part is warning against adultery again, with emphasis on its destructive consequences. Okay, Proverbs chapter 7, another warning against the adulterous woman. Okay, and then a vivid story of a young man being seduced into ruin by adulterous women. Trust me, there have been a lot of adulterous women who manage to to get men to marry them. Then the marriage becomes a problem. Okay, it's in churches a lot, not few, a lot. Okay, so the fact that somebody is singing well and all that does not mean you don't know their history. Some of them could be adulterous and manage to get a husband, and they will mess up a man's life. So you have to be careful if you're not married. Proverbs 7, watch it very carefully. A vivid story of a young man being seduced into ruin. Chapter 8, Proverbs chapter 8, wisdom personified speaks again. You see, personified as a woman speaks again. She was with God at creation. It doesn't mean it was a woman. It's using that like you use. When we're talking about America, a country, we use she because it delivers. It's women who deliver. So it doesn't mean it was a woman who was with God before Adam was created. No. She's using personification. It's using a woman's, character as wisdom. Okay? Because it can produce. It's women who are able to be impregnated and produce. Okay? Okay, wisdom offers life, truth, and righteousness. Okay, Proverbs chapter 9. Contrast between wisdom and foolishness. Both portrayed as women calling out. Okay? So the same thing, personify wisdom as a woman. Okay, foolishness can also be personified as a woman. Okay, so wisdom leads to life and foolishness leads to death. Okay, so there are women that come into your life, God can bless you more. There are many that are married today who are causing, some of them are stopping their men from achieving what God actually called them to be able to achieve. Okay, chapter 10 to chapter 29, that is what I talk about. Proverbs of Solomon, right? Okay, the one that I first thought to do chapter 10 to 20, and then he will talk about proverbial, maxims, okay? But they are all from Solomon. So chapter 10 to 29. These chapters contain short, pitchy sayings contrasting the wise and the foolish, the righteous and the wicked. So chapter 10, the Proverbs of Solomon begin. Contrast between wise and foolish, righteous and wicked. Chapter 11, righteousness brings life and security, but wickedness leads to destruction. Chapter 12, wisdom and discipline are praised. Fools despise correction. Okay, so that means fools don't like wisdom and discipline. Chapter 13, importance of discipline and wise companions. Wealth and poverty discussed in Proverbs chapter 13. If you want to be wealthy, if you are experiencing poverty, read Proverbs chapter 13. Proverbs chapter 14, wise versus foolish behavior. Fear of the Lord as a fountain of life. Proverbs chapter 15, gentle answers versus harsh words. God sees all. Righteousness is favored. Proverbs chapter 16, God's sovereignty over plans. Pride leads to downfall. Proverbs chapter 16, okay? And then humility is exalted. So Proverbs 16, if you and I have plans, let's carry it to God because God is sovereign. He knows what is better for you and I, okay? Proverbs chapter 17, peace, integrity, and wisdom in relationships, okay? So you read Proverbs chapter 17, you understand that. Proverbs chapter 18, power of words and tongue. And then the value of wisdom and humility. Okay, Proverbs chapter 19, the value of integrity, kindness to the poor, and discipline. Proverbs chapter 20, warnings about alcohol, justice, and honesty. Proverbs chapter 20. And so you can go there and read it if you have problem with alcoholism, okay? Proverbs chapter 21, righteousness is better than sacrifice, okay? And then God examines the hearts and actions, okay? Proverbs chapter 22, the value of a good name, the value of a good name. And then start of the sayings of the wise, okay? Proverbs chapter 22. And then Proverbs chapter 23, warnings against gluttony, drunkenness, and immorality, okay? Proverbs chapter 24, wisdom in times of trouble, okay? Don't envy the wicked, justice will prevail, okay? Proverbs chapter 25, more Proverbs of Solomon copied by Hezekiah's men, themes of restraint, humility, and patience. Proverbs chapter 26, fools and laziness ridiculed, okay? Because if we don't take the advice, wisdom will laugh at us, okay? And then Proverbs chapter 26 again, warnings about deceit and gossip, okay? So people who gossip a lot, and it's common among Christendom, among Christians. We love to gossip. Okay, Proverbs chapter 26. And Proverbs chapter 27, friendship, honesty, and hard work. Okay, Proverbs chapter 28, the consequences of sin and the blessing of righteousness. Okay, Proverbs chapter 29, okay, rulers, justice, discipline, and the consequences of stubbornness. And then Proverbs chapter 30 and 31, sayings of Agar and King Lemuel. Chapter 30, sayings of Agar, and then acknowledges human limitations, okay? Proverbs chapter 30. And then numerical sayings, 3 things. That is what I was talking about. There are certain things only God understands, okay? Numerical sayings, 2 things, 3 things, 4 things, okay? They are all strange. That's the way God has created it to be. Okay, Proverbs chapter 31, sayings of King Lemuel, taught by his mother, and the warnings to kings about women and alcohol. And then the virtuous woman, a noble wife, is praised for her wisdom, diligence, and godliness. Okay, so beloved, it looks like I am done with everything. So the summary, we're going to see chapter 1 to chapter 9. Wisdom is calling. It's a poetic and thematic, right? And then chapter 10 to 29, practical, short sayings, behavioral wisdom, okay? How we behave. And then chapter 30 to 31, reflections from other wise individuals, Agar and Lemuel. God richly bless you.